Okay, you want me to go ahead and get started?
Yep, you get us started.
Okay. So thank you all for joining us tonight on this iteration of our professional learning series. So my name is Dr. Brian Hibbs. I'm Associate Professor of Education / ESOL at Dalton State College. And I'm joined by the illustrious Dr. Alyssa Leckie, Associate Professor of English Learning Education from Georgia.
Yeah, there's a typo. That should be English learner education. I'm so embarrassed right now. Like, how many times have I looked at that slide and not seen that until now when I'm being live and recorded? Of course, right?
I do that all the time. I see PowerPoints and I go, when they're recording, but from Georgia Southern. And so our session tonight is on developing reflective ESOL practitioners. And so we're kind of going to split this sort of in two parts. So we'll kind of, I might say sort of three parts ish. So the first part is having you all sort of think about what is reflection? How do you all define reflection? What role does reflection play in your lives as an educator? So we'll initially do some kind of brainstorming and thinking about that. And then I will sort of take sort of reflection, looking on sort of the pre-service teacher side of things. So looking at sort of reflection, sort of different sort of definitions and concepts related to reflection, and then sharing some examples of how I embed reflection in the ESOL courses that I teach to prepare future elementary ed teachers. And then Dr. Leckie will take the second half and sort of talk about how to build reflection with the English learner population. So that's our agenda.
Dr. Hibbs, did you want to get on the Jamboard, you need to have it not in slideshow view? Is that it?
Well, I think I just put it in the chat.
Okay, okay, great.
So yeah, so I just put, so I thought what might be kind of helpful is to start, and maybe actually, if there's a, so in the chat, if you'll go to that link, what we've created is a Jamboard. And so what I'll kind of share, but so what you see on the Jamboard, so there are actually 2 pages. So the first page is thinking about your own definition of reflection. So what you'll do is, if you've maybe Jamboard before, you might be familiar with this. But if you look here on the left-hand side, the 4th tab down, it says sticky note. So what you do is create a sticky note and write whatever you want. You can change the color and then click save, and it'll post it. So first, what I'd like you to do is take a couple minutes and think about first, how do you define reflection? What does that word mean to you? How do you define it? And then if you'll turn the second page, is why is reflection important for you as an educator? So what role does reflection play in your professional life as a teacher? So if I'll give you a couple minutes so to work on that, and then we'll kind of see what everybody is thinking.
Reflection is process of deliberately considering one's experiences. Means critical analysis to gain insight. how do you define reflection? What is the next question again?
Yeah, if then the next tab, if you click where I'm showing you where it advances to the next frame, that's why is or if you want to put it in the chat if that's easier.
Okay.
Why is reflection important for you as an educator? So, why should educators engage in reflection?
Okay. Discussing language. It helps in discussing language challenges. Oh, got it there.
I'll give you all about like another 30 seconds and then we'll kind of see what we've
Yeah.
got.
Language. Probably down the line. In
Okay, so thanks for participating. So let's see what we've got. So we've got for the what is reflection? So we've got a number of responses. So reflection is a process of deliberately considering one's experiences and actions. It also means critical analysis to gain insight. Yeah, so reflection is definitely thinking about your behaviors, sort of like, but it's specifically sort of in the field of teaching. You think about sort of your teaching behaviors, but a reflection can occur in many different circumstances. But it's considering your sort of experiences and sort of your actions and trying to look at sort of like your thoughts, your behaviors in sort of more an objective way and analyzing what strengths and weaknesses you see. Reflection, self-investigation, questioning. Yes. And I would say that that's really important. That reflection is really kind of that questioning part, is really that self-questioning and investigating your own practice. And to me, to some extent, it also involves sort of this spirit of never being like 100% satisfied that, reflection in people who are reflective definitely should embody the mindset of, I'm not perfect and I totally know what I'm doing and everything is perfect and I don't need to progress. The reflection involves being introspective, but also I think being to some extent humble, recognizing that we all have sort of weaknesses, strengths and weaknesses, and really thinking about working on those, but really questioning what we're doing, why are we doing, and is it really working? Reflection is introspective, yes, but also can be part of groupthink. Yeah, I think that's actually a good point. Oftentimes, and I think we think that reflection is sort of an individual activity that can happen sort of like in our dark little corners or whatever. But definitely reflection can be sort of a social. It can definitely involve, a group or a pair, or it can involve more than one person. And then finally, it helps in discussing language challenges and probably down the line help in setting up goals. Yeah, I mean, I would say that that's kind of important too, sort of that action part. So the reflection is kind of typically, I think most people sort of think of as sort of like the mentor cognitive activity, which is definitely important and I think is a start. But I think if you reflect, but you don't take any action because, based on that reflection, then the reflection is somewhat useless. It's not really as helpful as it could be. That sort of that introspection is a first step, but action, it should lead to some kind of action based on what you've identified from your reflection. And then thinking about why is reflection important? So I've got a number of good responses here as well. So thinking about practice, what worked well, what could be better, what not to do next time out. It sharpens my practice, helps me better serve my students. Yeah, exactly. So And reflection, I think that brings up kind of a good point that, reflection should not be just sort of the negative, what didn't work, or the weaknesses of, say, like a lesson or something, an activity, but also thinking about what went well and why that might have happened as well. So it's really kind of having a balanced approach, I think. Reflection is important because it allows me to focus on what worked and why it worked. Yeah, and I think especially that why is really important. That reflection is kind of the why, just sort of not just, oh, that, students seem happy and students seem to have learned, okay, next thing. Really kind of started digging a little deeper, and being a little more introspective and thinking of, well, why might that have happened? And maybe that actually might involve maybe asking students, with, directly, or tickets out the door, or different things, to actually kind of not just anecdotally why you think it might have worked, but maybe even asking students why it worked or didn't work. Reflection helps me think about my strengths and weaknesses as a teacher. Yes. And as I mentioned previously, that the weaknesses, sometimes reflection, we'd sometimes think about just the weaknesses, but there's also this thinking about your strengths, I think is important too, and having that balanced approach to reflection. Reflection is important because it helps me refine my practice. Yes. So hopefully through thinking about sort of the strengths and weaknesses and working towards improvement, that your practice is becoming sort of more sort of effective, more sort of accurate through time. And then finally, reflection is important because it helps me see things that I didn't previously see or notice about myself or my students. Yes, absolutely. Because sometimes, especially if you're, and I find this sometimes when I teach, sometimes you're just so immersed in the moment. You're thinking about, I've got calling on this student, I've got this activity, and what's the next thing, and how am I going to organize the groups, and then how am I going to end this, and how do I transition to the next thing? Sometimes you might get so immersed in the middle of the lesson that you're not really have the time to necessarily sort of reflect. And so taking a step back and really kind of thinking about that, thinking about the lesson and hopefully seeing things that maybe you hadn't necessarily noticed at first glance. So good. So thank you for participating in that. So hopefully that gets your mojo going, so to speak, and have us, how do you start thinking sort of about reflection? So a couple definitions, and this is not to negate the definitions you all came up with, because I think they're very, very helpful, and they're, sort of solid, and we're largely getting at the same thing. But I thought of a couple of definitions that I found on reflection that I found helpful. So this first one is that reflection is a thinking process which gives coherence to a situation which is initially incoherent and unclear. So perhaps maybe in your reflection, maybe which we've kind of touched on a little bit as well. Maybe there's something going on, but you don't know why. Either it could be positive or it could be negative. But kind of really digging, as we've mentioned, kind of digging beyond sort of the superficial, what was good or bad, but maybe kind of the why, and that going through that process, making things more coherent and more clear to yourself. Another definition that I came across is reflection is the action of reviewing a series of previous experiences, events, stories, etc., and putting them together in such a way as to come to a better understanding or to gain some sort of insight. And I like this one because not only kind of delineates sort of the process sort of reflection, but where you're using a multitude of sources, if you will, in your reflection. So you're thinking about sort of your previous experiences and what you know, the events, what sort of actually happened, or stories if students come to you or you notice sort of this scenario or something, and really putting and maybe student comments, or just your own observations, putting all of that data, if you will, sort of together, and then to really kind of make your reflection sort of as accurate as you can, but as clear as you can, using as much information as you can, and then gaining some understanding by kind of putting all of those things together. So just a couple of things. I found this from the Richards and Lockhart book on reflective teaching in second language classrooms. But they talk about sort of 5 assumptions about the nature of teacher development And even though it's kind of more on the teacher development side, I think these assumptions, I think, can also guide reflection and should help us sort of think about reflection in a deeper way. So the first one is an informed teacher has an extensive knowledge base about teaching. So oftentimes, sometimes with reflection, we may assume that maybe we don't know something or maybe if somebody else kind of coming in doing a professional development scenario or something may sort of assume that you coming in that we're all tabula rasa, we're blank slates, we don't have any previous experience or knowledge or whatever, or things like that, which is usually, if not always, untrue. That we have experiences and knowledge and histories and things that we come to the table with. And so when you reflected about teaching, it's you're, I guess, as kind of the previous definition mentioned, you're really using that what your knowledge, your experiences, your abilities, your knowledge, and you're involving that becomes an important base to start with in your reflection. So it's not like reflection is coming in and telling you something that you don't know something, and well, we all do. Number two, much can be learned about teaching through self-inquiry. So, and I like actually that word, the inquiry, because it's more, I saw this years and years ago that somebody defined like inquiry as a stance. So it's sort of this questioning stance that you have about sort of situations about teaching, and which we've kind of touched on a bit before, but really sort of having that questioning attitude of, what is working, what is not, and why might that be happening. And then you might actually maybe just go beyond mere anecdotal evidence, maybe actually like doing teacher research or something to actually collect data to find, to kind of get more, data, if you will, more than just anecdotal basis of your reflections. Number three, much of what happens in teaching is unknown to the teacher, which is an aspect I find kind of interesting. So it's sort of this balanced approach. So as reflective practitioners, we do have a knowledge base for teaching. We have these previous knowledge, experiences, histories, etc., that help us inform our reflection, but also sort of that questioning aspect, and that a lot of that sometimes maybe if something did happen that was sort of positive, we may not know necessarily why that happened, and that it's hard to, even though as a reflective practitioner, sometimes it's hard to really capture everything. So maintaining sort of that questioning stance. Number four, experience is insufficient as a basis for development. And I think not only that's important, but sometimes that can be a bit of an Achilles heel, not just for reflective practitioners, but all teachers, for teachers in general sometimes, that they think that, well, because I've had a similar experience in the past and I've done this and this worked, okay, I know what to do. And that doesn't necessarily mean that is what's, just because it's been successful in the past doesn't mean it's going to be equally successful now. There's a lot of contextual factors and things that can come into play. And so just because you have lots of experience, that's important as a base, but that's not sufficient to develop. And finally, critical reflection can trigger a deeper understanding of teaching. And I think that critical also to me is a bit of a key word, that not just where you're not just for sort of reflecting for reflection's sake, but you're thinking about it sort of critically. You're trying to be more sort of objective or kind of look at things, from a more sort of objective and unbiased stance, but really, as we've kind of mentioned before, kind of digging more deeply. So I think these are assumptions that can really help us think about sort of reflection and why it's important, but some principles to help guide our reflection. So as I was doing research and thinking sort of types of reflection, I identified several sort of ways that people can reflect in different practices of ways that you might embed reflection in your own instructional practice. And some of these you may have heard of, and some of these researchers you might have heard of. So one is reflection in the sources that I consulted, that John Dewey was sort of seen as one of the first pioneers, so to speak, of reflection. And so he typically reviewed reflection as what's called reflection on action. So that would be you did sort of this event happened and you're reflecting post event. So you're reflecting sort of on something that happened in the past. So the event happens and you're reflecting sort of after that, which I think can be very valuable. And I think a lot of times reflection often sort of happens that way. But it's not the only way that reflection can happen. There are different ways you might embed it in your practice. So Shun, which I imagine that's how you pronounce it, the reflective practitioner, if you're familiar with his work in the 80s, expanded Dewey's concept and focused on what his expanded that and called what's called reflection in action. So where you're kind of doing something in the moment and you're reflecting as you're doing it, sort of with the immediacy of the event. But there's several others that also I found that was sort of interesting. That so Killing and Toddenham, they talk about reflection for action. So maybe you're sort of inverting it. So maybe you're reflecting before you're actually teaching your lesson or teaching the activity. I know sometimes in my practice, I sometimes would do that as I'm planning, because I'm planning the activities and then in my head, I'm playing a scenario of how I think this is going to play out. And then thinking about, well, what might go wrong, or how might I manage this, or how am I going to do this, manage that. So you can actually sort of reflect, reflection for action. So you're reflecting before, pre-activity or pre-lesson. Farrell, who's somebody is a name that's somewhat familiar in the SLA literature on reflection, talks about a concept called reflection as action. So typically when we're thinking about reflection, we're thinking about sort of our pedagogical aspect of our persona. But he's really sort of tries to sort of enlarge our view, think about more encompassing view about who we are, not just pedagogically, but who are we spiritually, who are we emotionally, who are we psychologically, who are we, and these sort of different aspects of our actual educator or teacher identity. And sort of moving beyond just sort of the pedagogical and sort of a more holistic view of who we are as a practitioner, and really kind of thinking that, sort of more thoroughly. And then finally, I found a concept on reflection as meta action, which would be sort of like reflecting on reflecting, which I think is kind of another sort of level how you might do it. Because oftentimes we sort of reflect and then kind of like, well, where does that sort of actually go? But if you're reflecting on your reflection, sort of this meta reflection, I think can be important, because you might start to analyze your reflective practice and say, okay, I've been reflecting, but is this actually helping me? What do I need to do to improve my reflections and to get more out of, your observations and all of that? So what I also want to end this, I will be in my portion. So I want to just share several just quick ways that I try to embed reflection in the ESOL courses that I teach. So I largely work with elementary education pre-service teacher candidates. And so there's several ways that I try to embed reflection in the classes in different ways. So one is a relatively obvious way, is that they do a lot of critical assignments where they're reflecting on a Georgia PSC ESOL standards. And so they do a lot of that. And so we kind of talk about not only the importance of reflection, but we do kind of reflection sometimes as I'm walking them through the assignments. And so where reflection is really embedded in our thinking about the assignments. And then I give guiding questions in those assignments to kind of help them actually guide them in sort of thinking about how they might think about something. In each of the ESOL classes, the first class meeting, I have some kind of belief handout that's related to the content of the course. So like in the applied linguistics class, it's a handout that has different statements concerning common beliefs people hold about language. Or in the methods class, it's based off of if you remember, the Bali's of beliefs about language learning inventory that Horowitz had created in the 80s. But it was sort of statements taken from that. And so we're related to, so beliefs people commonly might hold about language learning and language teaching, things like that, or beliefs people commonly hold about English learners. And so they go through each of the statements. They put like A, if they agree with the statement, D, if they disagree, or U, if they're undecided. And then we have a class discussion about some of the statements and kind of why what difference of opinion do we see, or do we have common opinions? And just really kind of starting to really think through those things, because what I share with the teacher candidates is, it's important, that reflection is really important, but this is a good spot to do it, because a lot of the ways that you're going to, like with the methods class, the way that you teach English learners, the way that you interact with them and teach them, those come from your own beliefs. And so it's natural kind of at the first class to start thinking about some of those things. And then finally, some things that I do is sort of a secondary goal for me for the ESOL classes that I teach is to really expand the teacher candidates' linguistic horizons, if you will, because a lot of them are native English speakers that have not had much contact with other people from multicultural, multilingual backgrounds. And so I always try to embed different things to really have them sort of reflect on what does it feel like to be an English learner, but also develop their metalinguistic awareness of different languages and how they work. So for example, from time to time, we do what I call introductions of the day, where we learn how to say hello, welcome, my name is, count from 1 to 10 and say goodbye, but in really different languages, so like Russian or Swahili or Urdu or something like that. We did, Albanian or Albanians one we did recently. Or another one I call language text of the day, where they have a paragraph, I give them a paragraph, and it's either in French, Spanish, or Italian. And a lot of them, we sometimes have some Spanish speakers, but where I give them that paragraph, and then I give them a few minutes with their neighbors, with their, with other students, and then see if they can interpret or decipher the paragraph and what words they can connect with. So what words like look like English or sound like English or spelled like English or other languages, and can they bring that to bear to really interpret the paragraph and how it's working. Finally, another one that I like to do is called a cognate of the day. So a word that is similar between English and other languages. And so I have on a PowerPoint slide, it's like English, French, Spanish, Italian, and Portuguese, and what that word is, and the phonetic in that language, and then the phonetic transcription, but words similar to English. And then I have them kind of do some dissecting. Okay, what patterns are you noticing? What similarities / differences do you notice between the spelling of the words, or the structure of the words, or the pronunciation of the words, to really kind of not only develop their own metalinguistic awareness, but also activities, kind of modeling activities that they can actually use with their English learners in their own classrooms. So those are just several kind of examples of ways that I try to embed reflection with the teacher candidates.
And Brian, Brendan asked the question about how do you do these kind of strategies with in a pre-service program with teachers who do not have English as their first language?
Well, and sometimes I was going to mention this, sometimes with the language text, and because Dalton State is an HSI, Hispanic Serving Institution. So what we have is minimally 25%, officially the official governmental definition is that 25% of the students enrolled at a given institution self-identify as Hispanic or Latinx. And I think for us, it's 26, so slightly higher. So what I kind of do is sometimes I try to, the language text, especially if it's in Spanish, or we do like foreign words of the day, that actually kind of tap into their linguistic repertoire sort of in Spanish. And I've actually been trying to do a little more of that in the applied linguistics this semester, where in addition to talking about like English phonology, morphology, syntax, and orthography, all of that fun stuff, to actually start doing that in Spanish. So where I've designed and I'm trying them out this semester as part of a research project, where we're doing like many activities focused on Spanish phonology, Spanish syntax, and all of that, and then doing some jigsaw readings about some of these aspects, so that teacher candidates that are native speakers of English at least have a basic understanding of Spanish and how it works, because the vast majority of the English learners in our area are native Spanish speakers, so they have an understanding of that. But it also taps into the teacher candidates that are Spanish speakers, because a lot of them are what we call heritage speakers, where some of them may not know Spanish at all, just because somebody is Hispanic or Latinx doesn't mean they speak Spanish, first of all. But a lot of them do, but even if they do, a lot of them are called like heritage speakers, where, they know their conversational register of Spanish, but they may not know necessarily the academic register. And more particularly, they may not know about sort of the nuts and bolts of Spanish and how Spanish works. So they really get something kind of out of that too. So for you, kind of, if you have sort of non-native speakers, you might maybe sort of flip it. So maybe you actually have sort of like language text where you're taking paragraphs from sources that are in English. But also, I think even if they're non-native speakers, like I say, with the introductions of the day, I mean, I try to really push the envelope of languages that I'm sure nobody speaks so that everybody's kind of in the same boat. I've even done a little bit of that with a language that you might have heard of. It's called Dothraki, which is the language of Game of Thrones. And so I've actually had a friend of mine during summer. He got me this book. It's like this little booklet. It's like 60 pages. It's more or less sort of like the linguistics of Dothraki. So you have a pronunciation guide, they have verb conjugation charts and kind of all of that. And I've had the idea that maybe at some point that's something I might want to do, is actually kind of teach them. I don't speak Dothraki, but I know a little bit, but actually sort of teach them a bit about sort of the linguistics of Dothraki and sort of how that works, so that so that might be something too. Or maybe using that, or Klingon. I have a friend of mine who's a professor at University of Arizona that actually teaches Klingon to students as a language class. So you might use languages, or not the language that's used in Avatar. So you might use kind of languages like that, or so that everybody sort of is in that sort of same boat, linguistic boat, as it were.
Yeah, Dr. Hibbs, can I interject too very quickly? To respond to Brendan's question as well, or to build on your response to his question, I think reflecting on what I know and understand about language helps students better identify patterns in other languages and their own language. So one of the big challenges we have as ESOL practitioners is we focus so much on the errors, right? What students are doing wrong, what they don't know, instead of identifying the patterns that language has, so that we can more clearly explain those patterns to students. So one of the things that, looking at different languages, reflecting on our own use of language, reflecting on what I know about language and what I don't know about language, really helps me better explain how language works to other people. Right? Just because I might know Klingon or Korean or Arabic or Spanish does not mean that I can explain Klingon, Korean, Arabic, or Spanish to somebody else, right? Because if the example I use a lot in our applied linguistics course, for example, is, can you explain to me why we use do instead of does when we're making questions or as a verb tense? Like, you can hear it when it's not used correctly, right, as a native English speaker, but to explain why to a third grader, right, is a challenging task. And so I think the more that we allow and provides those scaffold experiences that Dr. Hibbs has put there for us to look at language as language and reflect on those patterns and what we see and know and understand about language, really helps us be more clear about explaining English or another language and its patterns to other people. Sorry. Thank you for letting me interject.
No, and I would agree. I probably talked way around the bush around it, but eventually that's sort of, and that's really, I would say, one of the main reasons I like to use those kind of activities with students is, like I say, not only expand their linguistic horizons, as it were, but also sort of develop their meta-linguistic awareness. So they're able actually, like Dr. Leckie mentioned, they're able to sort of articulate what patterns are they noticing, or how something is similar or different, and know why that might be, but have the linguistic knowledge, but also the linguistic vocabulary to explain it. Good. So thank you. So any other questions on my section of the presentation? Okay, and if you do, you're more than welcome to put them in the chat. So So that was sort of thinking about sort of reflection as us as educators and practitioners. So Dr. Leck is going to speak to us now about how to embed reflection with K-12 students, K-12 English learners.
Or even adult English learners, right? And so instead of thinking about the English teacher, let's think about the English learner and how we can embed some of those practices for reflection amongst all of our students, regardless of age. So this slide is something that applies to incorporating great reflection or reflection opportunities for all students, right? I don't care if you're an EL, not an EL adult or a small child, but reflection really does help us learn. It helps us learn in a variety of ways, right? When I reflect on I can cement my own understanding of content concepts, right? Do I understand this content? Do I understand the content of photosynthesis, for example? But also reflecting on my process for learning that content. Did labeling that diagram really help me understand the process of photosynthesis? Or did I understand it better when I read that paragraph about photosynthesis in class the other day? And really being clear to myself helps me understand how I learn best in areas that I need to grow as a learner. And I think when we provide our students opportunities to reflect on their understanding of content, as well as how they learned, we help them become better, stronger, more independent learners moving forward, and better able to advocate for themselves and what they need in the future. Second, I think when we pause and we embed opportunities for reflection into our instructional practice, we help foster that community of learning. Like, we are all in here to learn. We are all in here to do better. We are all in here to grow, and we learn more together. And when we think about reflection and we embed those practices, we give ourselves permission to not be perfect, and we give our students permission, like Dr. Hibbs mentioned earlier, as educators, to not be perfect, right? We still have room to grow, and we're all here growing together instead of being intimidated by not having it right all of the time. And finally, going along with that very first bullet, reflection really does help students select their own learning goals, select their learning strategies, and measure their own outcomes. It helps them become more independent and lifelong learners. All right, next slide, please. All right, so thinking about our multilingual learners, regardless of what second language I'm learning and what the home language is that I'm learning from, when we thoughtfully incorporate reflection into our instructional practice, we are fostering two things: identity development and language development. There are multiple opportunities, and the next slide will give us some ideas about when we embed types of activities and strategies that foster reflection. It really helps me build that sense of self and that I'm worthy, right? That who I am and what I've been through is okay, and I'm here with a purpose. The other piece that is really important for us is that if we are thoughtful and intentional about how we scaffold those reflection opportunities, man, how many opportunities for language development do we have, right? Because as the teacher, I need to see evidence of your reflection, and that evidence is going to come out through your verbal language, your spoken language, or your written language. So I'm going to give you opportunities to think about and reflect inside your own head, or perhaps even with a partner, but all of those opportunities you have to speak and write in a relevant and meaningful way are really, really powerful. So let's talk about some ways we can do that. Next slide, please. All right, so when you are facilitating reflection among our multilingual learners, I've just put 5 strategies. There are lots of things we can do, but these are some kind of go-to, and I always call them low prep strategies because none of us have time for a really fancy, complicated reflection strategies, right? So 1, practice having students explain how they solved a problem, how they completed a task, because if they can't explain how they did that, they're missing a piece of that learning, right? And that also helps us pinpoint where misconceptions occurred, where problems occurred. It gives us information that we can use as teachers, as well as information that our students can use as learners. I strongly encourage collaborative reflection, having students talk to each other about how they solved a problem, how they're feeling about a context or a situation, how they think they did. One, because I'm all about that language development, but two, it does really help build that community of learners when we're sharing our own strengths and weaknesses with everybody. And that's just our classroom culture, because we all have strengths and areas for growth in different areas. So the more we make that part of our classroom conversation and classroom culture, the more comfortable it becomes and the more meaningful it becomes. Finally, not finally, but the next aspect is thinking about those culturally sustaining practices. How can you embed opportunities for storytelling and lived experiences? Because I am where I am today because of where I've been before, right? My previous experiences brought me to where I am. So I struggle with art. I'm intimidated by the fact that I have to draw a visual to support my students' learning, because I had an art teacher that totally critiqued my drawing of palm trees. Like, it's a very vivid memory I have. So reflecting on me as a teacher or our students and their lived experiences really provides opportunities for them to say, oh, that's perhaps why I'm really good at this, or perhaps why I'm not so great at this, and helps them move forward and helps you all learn about them as well. And finally, just asking those questions. How do you know that? How do you know that? And what would you do differently next time? So these reflective activities can be done in conversation. They can be done as written things or documents as students produce as they're leaving a classroom or finishing up an assessment. But really asking them to think about their own learning throughout will help them be more lifelong, independent, and accountable learners. All right. Dr. Hibbs, if you want to stop sharing, maybe we can just open the floor to questions for the last couple of minutes we have. If anybody has questions or thoughts or wants more ideas or wants to share their own experiences with incorporating opportunities for reflection in their own practice.
Okay, I would like to ask a question and how do you push your students beyond the surface level reflection to go deeper with their thinking to get the most out of it?
Yeah, you're so right. Because if reflection is taken on by us as a teacher as a superficial task, like I'm just adding this question onto the test, right? Their students are going to be superficial about it as well. I do it in a couple of ways, and then I'll let Dr. Hibbs chime in on how he moves beyond the superficial to the deep. One, I model it a lot. I do a lot of think alouds when I'm at the board, when I'm thinking about a question, when I'm looking at a prompt. Here's how I would respond to that. Here's why I would respond to it that way. So I model how to do it. Because if you think about, and I'm not familiar with school systems all across the world, but in our US school system, we really don't foster reflection much. We foster correct answers, immediate correct answers. And so we have to break a lot of bad habits because our students are used to, you ask me how I think I did that. Oh, I did fine. Right? Because they want an immediate answer. And so there's that piece of modeling that process and making it consistent. I would also scaffold with lots of different questions and know that it takes time, right? So really thinking from the beginning of your semester or your year to the end of that time frame to really model and push and show student reflections. Like I would show some anonymized student reflections that were amazing. Like, I'm really proud of this student. Look at this reflection. Here's what I like about this reflection. And I would highlight some specific aspects of that reflection that were really powerful or really above and beyond what you're seeing in the norm so that they have a model. right? Because a lot of times I think we have not provided models throughout a student's educational experience. Brian, you want to add anything onto that?
Yeah, actually, I guess the short answer would be ditto, but because I think a lot of those actually would also apply. I was thinking like, yeah, a lot of those would actually apply, and that I also embed with teacher candidates. So I think sort of the modeling is really important, and also providing opportunities for them to reflect, and sort of building that in and kind of pushing that, even if they say, you know, like something I do in the first class meeting of the methods class is I play them again, helping them kind of embed and sort of reflect on what does it feel like to be an English learner. So I play, the first 4.5 minutes, but it's an hour-long documentary about World War II, but it's all in French with no subtitles. So they have to sort of watch that, and then they have questions in French that they have to try to answer. And so we kind of go over that, but then, we do something like reflection. Okay, what were you thinking? What were you feeling? And sort of why, and kind of all of that. So not only kind of modeling that, but sort of structuring that, and not just sort of expecting that. And I would say the same thing sometimes with discussions. You can't just, you have to plan for it. It just doesn't it can organically happen, but more often than not, it doesn't happen. Or if it's not, it's not going to be all that successful. So kind of building that intentionally, and then pushing, well, why were you, and sometimes students will, why were you, kind of like what Dr. Lecky was saying, why do you feel that way? In, those kind of things. So modeling that, and also kind of providing examples of reflections. That's something I do from time to time with the teacher candidates, that, you cover this reflection versus this reflection. Like if a student, for like one of the critical assignments they do is a website review, where they review a website for English learners or for ESOL teachers that they might use, and they sort of do a review, sort of a summary, and then a reflection and review on that, but showing them sort of an example. Like if you have the students, like the sentence is one reflection, like the reflection is one sentence, and says, this website review helped me learn how to use technology with English learners. Well, whoop-de-doo. I mean, that's all nice, well and good, but that doesn't tell me anything. So showing them sort of examples, but also, like, I wouldn't say bad examples, but maybe less reflective, less good examples, I guess, if you will. But, showing them, not only modeling that, but them showing them. And I think especially not for teacher candidates, that's important, but especially I think for English learners. We talk about all the time about using sentence frames, sort of structures, that's where they can frame their responses. So, if you're providing models of how they should phrase their sentences, then for how they should frame their reflections, that makes total sense.
And just to finish off that thought, remembering that it's really hard to admit that we don't know things, to admit our weaknesses, right? And so just that, creating that classroom culture and that classroom environment is really essential to having good thoughtful reflection.
Can I just piggyback on what you guys are saying? I completely agree with you. And I had a conversation with a student of mine today, and she was telling me about something that went completely wrong in her class yesterday. And we had this conversation. What did you do? How did you model? And she couldn't answer that. So that was the whole thing. And then, from thinking about the lens thinking about things from the assessment, and if we don't get the responses that we want from our students, we do have to go back to the question, what did we actually ask? And so, like Brian was saying, asking those why questions versus a what, reminds me of when we were, I was doing my dissertation, and we were always talking about, well, you cannot have a dissertation question that ends in a yes or no question. It has to be something that is exploratory, right? So, thinking about how we're even questioning is a really powerful piece, I think. And it's something I always have to be aware of. And it's part of my reflection as a practitioner, honestly. So if my students aren't producing what I want them to produce, let me go back first before I accuse them. Me personally, before I say they didn't study or whatever the case is, what did I actually ask? And how did I phrase that? Could I phrase it a different way? Maybe they didn't understand what I was trying to get at, all these different things. I run into that with rubrics a lot, but that's a whole thing. Just being clear about what I'm even expecting. But we cannot overlook the modeling piece. I know we try to kind of zoom through it. That modeling is so critical to our students learning. So yeah, that's all I want to say.
Any other thoughts or questions for the good of the cause in the last, I don't know, 8-9 minutes we have?
I'm just thinking that this is, we have in my school district, we have a whole new group of veteran ESOL teachers that we've invited to come in to be our faculty for our ESOL endorsement. And we've spent the summer, training them. They've been reading, they've been reflecting, they've been looking over the established syllabi and, doing all of these kind of things. But I'm just thinking that this recording is going to be a great thing to share with them to help them, really start to think about the way they need to approach this working with adult learners, because this is we're K-12 school district. So this is the big transition, right? They're teaching K-12 students during the day, but then this one evening every week, they are going to be embarking on this brand new journey. And I just think this is a very, very important topic. And just, I'm sorry I was a smidge late getting here, traffic, and then I haven't been feeling so well. So I'm a little sniffly, but thank you, Dr. Hibbs. Thank you, Dr. Leckie. I mean, I just have found this to be very, very helpful.
And actually, can I ask a question? Alyssa, can you say more about this notion of advocacy as a way of, no, I'm sorry, back up, reflection as a means of advocacy you were talking about with the students? I found that really powerful.
Right. So if I am a student, upon my reflection where I've been successful in class because I've had lots of diagrams and visuals, and I have been less successful understanding a concept where I've only had a paragraph, instead of just going up to a teacher and saying, I don't get it, I'm confused. Now I have some knowledge about my own learning where I'm able to say to them, could you help me create a diagram, or can we draw together a visual about this concept? Because doing a visual really helps me learn. But if I haven't taken that time to reflect on my own learning, how can I tell a teacher this is what I need as a learner? Or maybe really and truly, like, I do better when I'm reading independently and not with all that group work. Like, the group work is too chaotic, there's too much language. So can you help me find a text that I can take home and read by myself that will solidify the concepts we did in the group? Because there's too much language happening around when I'm in a group. Like, whatever that is, if I don't know it, I can't advocate for myself.
I could add something to that. I feel like once as an ESOL teacher, when you go to your classroom or the students come to your classroom, you kind of prepare what you're going to deliver. But in course of time, while you're delivering something, you feel that you are getting into a more bigger world. You teach something that you were supposed to teach, but at the same time, you're teaching something that you did not plan it. Because one of the students prompted, I would like to share something. The other day in my grade 12 class, it's an ESOL class, ESOL 4 class, I was teaching them the Beowulf, the epic poem. So while I was teaching, like, we were discussing about the ages, we were talking about the Anglo-Saxon, we spoke about how people looked back then. Of course, none of us has seen, we just watched the YouTube, and one of the students, suddenly he started sketching a Beowulf, like how he would look. So that sparked me an idea. Okay, now guys, come on, let's go ahead and draw a Beowulf, how he might look in your, like, what do you think he might look like? What do you think he wore? What do you think he had a sword? So I feel like when you're teaching something, you tend to understand, you tend to model something, and then you come up with something. It's a whole new world, I could say. Every time I plan something, I don't finish up. Instead, I add more to that piece. I think it happens with everybody there, but then I'm learning. This is my first year ESOL in America. Also, I was a teacher back in Saudi teaching the students like the ESOL there. So the ESOL is completely different back in Saudi, and back in US is completely different. We have set standards. Back in Saudi, we design our own curriculum, like how the students are going to work, what they're going to work. We do the diagnostic, but I really like the plan. They have a diagnostic set up, and then the levels decided, the emerging, the developing. I'm kind of impressed, and I'm kind of loving it.
Where are you teaching?
I'm at West Side High School in Macon area.
Oh, super. Fantastic.
Yes,
Well,
ma'am.
great
And
to-
I think, and when I'm teaching, I did my CELTA certification. Like I am like certified Cambridge teaching the adults. Now, when I'm teaching them, I think the real value of CELTA is showing up in my teaching skills.
Awesome.
Yes,
That's fantastic.
yes, ma'am.
Very cool.
And I'm happy to be here with you all, understanding every concept, getting all those minute details, adding it to my knowledge box.
Well, hopefully we'll see you at our conference in October too.
Yes, ma'am. I'm planning to attend one.
Great, great.
Brendan, where are you before we end up? I know they want to, but I wasn't here at the beginning. So if there were introductions, where are you?
Right now I'm in Savannah. I teach at SCAD, but I'm also doing some teacher development with Southern New Hampshire University.
Oh, very cool. That's so neat. Well, it's great to meet both of you. All right, I'm shutting up now. Lisa and Brent and Brian and Karen can tell you I will socialize all night, so I better shut up.
Well, I know I greatly appreciate you all being here. I greatly appreciate everybody that's listening to this recording at a later date. And like I said, hopefully we'll see you all at Georgia TESOL in October.
Yes, ma'am. Will I be getting the recording of this conference or the meeting that we have?
Yeah.
You will. You'll be getting an email really from me, but it'll have a recording and they'll ask you for your feedback.
Yes, ma'am. Whatever the GATESOL is providing, I'm trying to register for every workshop and like, okay, did I get accepted with that? And I am kind of waiting on the Zoom links. So this was my first with the GATESOL, but I'm happy to be here.
That's so wonderful. We'd love to have more presence in Macon, so it's so great for you to be here. Thank you so much.
And feel free to share the link with colleagues if that you think would enjoy it. I mean, it's absolutely fine. We are really, this professional learning series is really an act of love and professional, generosity by our wonderful presenters, like Elisa and Brian, who are just sharing their knowledge. And, it's Georgia TESOL is the conduit to just make sure that everybody has a chance to share.
I have a question. I've got a couple of friends back in Saudi who are interested in being the members. I don't know how does it work. Is it okay if they register and attend the conference?
They are welcome.
Yeah, and with the virtual component, it's very easy for them to participate in that virtual conference. We actually have a lot of international attendees coming.
Okay.
And we priced it so we tried to price it so it's pretty darned affordable. We wanted to encourage folks to be able to be a part of it, regardless of their particular context. And so but if anybody we would love for them. We would absolutely love for them to participate. We were trying to break down barriers.
Yeah, the only thing that could be a problem is the time zone. And I think at this time it's a midnight going on over there. So if anybody's seriously interested, they're going to be awake and then attend the class.
We're going across, we're already looking, we have registrants across like how many time zones? 6. So we're going to have to, David, I think we're going to be awake for 24 hours around the virtual conference.
Oh,
I'm not exactly sure how this is going to work, but David mentioned that Dr. Chiesa, who's our conference chair, and I think it's going to end up, being a marathon so that we can offer, some live interaction during as many, high, ideal, log on times for as many time zones as possible. So what I came away from that conversation from Dr. Chiesa was that it's quite likely that we're going to be awake for 24 hours.
mm-hmm.
And
Get more
also,
funding.
if you have colleagues in Saudi who want to be a part of the PLS series, just tell them to register, because we send a link out to everyone who registered. So whether or not they were able to come, we send it
Okay.
out to everyone who registers. So as long
Yes,
as they
ma'am.
register, we're all set. They'll get it.
Yes, ma'am. I'll do that. I'll take care of that. But
Awesome.
thank you so much, everybody. Being a busy day, being a working day, everybody made it. I'm so happy for that.
All right.
Have a great night, everybody.
Have a good
Bye-bye.
night.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Good night. Nice.
Good night.